therefore respectfully want to make it clear that I will not resign. To do so would be to preempt a process defined by the Constitution. To do so would be to give credence to a panel report that unfortunately has grave flaws.
President Cyril Ramaphosa reckons he's got a fair chance challenging an independent panel's findings that he may have broken the law in relation to the 2020 theft of a large sum of money from a couch based at his Phala Phala game lodge. But this report, overseen by retired Chief Justice Sandile Ngcobo, is not the only one Ramaphosa should be worried about. In this edition of The Lead, investigative journalist Kyle Cowan explains the criticalness of IPID's revelations. And we rewind everything to give you a much clearer sense of the entire Phala Phala saga right up until this very moment. Ready? Let's go.
I think that IPID's findings about the purpose of the trip to Namibia is deeply significant to the president for the reason that his public version and the public version of those around him has already provided the reason, so-called reason for the trip to Namibia. If the president was involved, and we know he was involved in instructing Rueda to accompany Chauke to Namibia, and that trip was about Phala Phala and the arrest of Emanuela David, it places President Cyril Ramaphosa directly involved in the cover-up of months after it happened. That, in my view, would be a very serious and impeachable offense.
Later in the show, the mayor of Welkom was tarred and feathered on this very day in SA History, our regular segment. And in Roby's Pointless Bike was a bit of a difficult question for today. Now, which model of Mercedes-Benz did a TikToker drive in which he's seen on video doing so recklessly in the Kruger National Park? I'll give you that answer, unfortunately, a little later. My name's Graeme Robenheimer, this is The Lead, and this is the South African story. Moving to our top story today, and if you're feeling lost in this Phala Phala saga so far, you've come to the right place. We've roped in News 24 investigative journalist Kyle Cowan to hold our hands through this intense political and legal story. Kyle, how's it?
Graeme, well, thanks to you. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, this is quite an ingewikkelde story, as they say. Yeah. But it is one of the biggest that we've seen, at least from a political perspective, in the last, I don't know, just more than 10 years. Certainly since the Nkandla saga, this has been one to watch. Look, let's first say that obviously the president addressing the nation this week, claiming he's innocent here, he's denied all wrongdoing, he, is not going anywhere, he's not resigning, and he's now taking former Chief Justice Sandile Ngcobo's panel review report on review, that this stalls Parliament somewhat in the impeachment process going forward, or does it, Kyle?
No, so it actually doesn't, and I think that this is going to be quite a novel legal issue. And constitutional law expert Pierre de Vos, who writes a regular column for News 24, actually pointed out that, as the Constitutional Court ruling has made it very clear, the impeachment process must go ahead. And there isn't, according to de Vos, there isn't a mechanism whereby the High Court can actually interdict, a Constitutional Court order's practical effect from going ahead. So in my view, I think it's going to be quite messy, but we may have like these parallel processes running where Parliament may sort of slow walk it, but we've already seen announcements by the Speaker that they're going to move ahead and establish the impeachment committee. And then, President Ramaphosa has said that he'll institute this review on an urgent basis. He used the word expeditious, which, translates to urgent. But it's not going to, I think, halt the impeachment process from going ahead. And in fact, National Chairperson of the ANC, Graeme, was also quite clear in his comments just prior to the president making those announcements that it doesn't matter if the president were to resign or, no longer occupy office, the impeachment process has to go ahead. That's sort of what's mandated. So it's going to be interesting, I think, to see once the court papers have finally been filed, sort of what the legal argument is and what they're going to try and ask the High Court to do here.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we're going to try and be as quote unquote expeditious as possible in our discussions to keep you in the loop of what we understand, the entirety of the saga thus far. But I'd like for us, Kyle, quickly to just go back to mid-2022. Here comes out Arthur Fraser. And of course, he's our former state security agency boss. Was also headed up at correctional services for a time. Here he comes out in mid-2022 with these allegations. And at the time, he was claiming that there were millions in US dollars in that fateful couch in Phala Phala. Take us back to what he alleged at that time very quickly.
So very simple. He went to the Rosebank police station here in Johannesburg and he filed a complaint against several individuals, including the president, a criminal complaint. And he provided an affidavit in support of this. And in this affidavit, he accuses the president and some of his top aides, including his special advisor, Dr. Bajani Chauke, and the head of his security, Major General Wally Roode, who actually works for the South African Police Service, of orchestrating not only a cover-up, but of bringing this money into the country unlawfully. He alleged that between $4 and $6 million were hidden on the farm and then stolen on the night of the 9th of February 2020. So far, I must say that, Arthur Fraser's complaint has so far shown to be, mostly true. There isn't, there were some issues around certain individuals he alleged were involved and so on that later turned out to be, the sort of stories that you find around such a major scandal that sort of crop up and sort of hearsay things. But for the most part, what Fraser alleged, the central allegations, the break-in, the apparent investigation, the off-the-books investigation, attempts to cover it up, that has all sort of been proven. However, the only criminal case currently running stemming from that complaint in June of 2022 is a case against the burglars and one of the burglars, Emanuela David, and a cleaner, Floriana Joseph, and her brother David Joseph. Floriana is alleged to have spotted the dollars, in the house while, cleaning there, and having then alerted her brother, who in turn contacted Emanuela David. That case has been running in the Modimolle Regional Court for the better part of the past year.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that and ventilate it a little bit further in the next short while. But Ramaphosa at the time, around 2022, when all of this came to bear, Kyle, if we cast our minds back, he denied Fraser's allegations from the outset. What was his version of events? Enter the story of the Sudanese businessman, and in Ramaphosa's view, the total monetary value at the time was rather in the thousands of US dollars as opposed to the millions that Fraser claimed, right?
Yeah, so very early on, within a couple of days of Fraser's allegations becoming public, because of course Fraser did not simply go to the police and just report the crime and then walk away. There was, sort of a journalist by the name of Mzilikazi Wa Africa, and his publication was sort of lined up to run with the story. And very soon after that, the affidavit became public and we were able to start interrogating the contents thereof. And around about the same time, the presidency came out and said, listen, yes, there was a break-in. It did happen on the 9th of February, but only $580,000 was stolen. That was their initial version, and they were saying that this was proceeds from the sale of game, and the president is, an avid game farmer and is involved in, his companies now are involved in regular auctions of very high value sort of game, and it's not unusual for his private activities to involve the sale of some animals. It took us a while, but eventually we got to the figure of $580,000, and that the sale was for buffalo. It took us a longer while to figure out that the president's version of this was that Hazim Mustafa is a Sudanese businessman married to a South African woman from Westville in Durban, now currently living in Dubai. And the story was that Mustafa had come to South Africa with his wife to celebrate Christmas in 2019. And on Christmas Day, they were at Sun City, the resort, an hour's drive or so away from Johannesburg. And Mustafa had the money, and it was obviously burning a bit of a hole in his pocket. And on his version, he climbed in a limousine and landed up, about 2 hours later at the president's farm in Limpopo after traveling kilometers on dusty gravel roads, and handed over $580,000 for 20 buffalo that the farm was looking to get rid of because of the cost of maintenance, etc. The buffalo have been described as subpar, not of the standard that would be used to breed high-value animals and so on. And that version only really came out a couple of months later because of sort of investigative reporting efforts and us managing to get hold of submissions to various investigations, including by the public protector.
Right. Okay. Then we get the former Chief Justice, Sandile Ngcobo. He gets formally tasked with looking into all of this. He hears what he has to hear from the president. He looks at Fraser's criminal complaint. And the ex-CJ's findings ultimately come up with prima facie or prima facie evidence. There's two different ways of that pronunciation in Latin, although Patricia DeLille likes to think it's prima facie. She's quoted in the past of saying that.
South Africanisms.
Yeah, South Africanisms. Anyway, so he comes up with this finding and basically goes, Ramaphosa may have violated the constitution here by taking on paid work when he's obviously elected into the executive and may not do so because he's the president, and also found that he may have broken the country's anti-corruption laws, right? That's essentially what that report found.
Yeah, it finds that Ramaphosa has a case to answer, an impeachment case to answer. So just to take a step back, the Section 89 panel that was chaired by retired Justice Ngcobo it's an official constitutional process. So Section 89 deals with the removal of the president. And, this preliminary investigation, this preliminary step is part of that process that has been set out by the Constitution and part of rules then adopted by Parliament to give effect to that, to say, okay, well, we can't just entertain every single motion of impeachment, to establish an impeachment inquiry. We have to have a process. And that process devolved into that report that was put out in November of 2022. And to be fair to everyone involved, that report was immediately made public. It was published. It made these very serious findings against the president, and actually drove the president to the very brink of resignation. I think that for Cyril Ramaphosa, that report was an immense shock. And while we can sit here for probably 2 or 3 hours going through it line by line and sort of finding every single factual mistake in that report, I think what needs to be front of mind when you think about that Section 89 report is that it is a preliminary investigation. It was done on an extremely short time frame. There were no forensic accountants or forensic lawyers. They had no subpoena power. They relied on evidentiary submissions to them by various political party members, and they did an analysis of that. And based on all of these versions, including a version offered under oath by the president himself, they concluded that he has a case to answer. Now, what the Constitutional Court has now told us is that instead of the ANC sort of being allowed to use its majority to quash that report and not adopt it into, a full impeachment hearing, Parliament's rules were wrong and unlawful and unconstitutional, therefore allowing that. That's really the mechanics of this. The impeachment hearing must now take place because Parliament's rules were unconstitutional. That's where we are. That's where we're going to be going in the next few weeks and months. And I think that it's going to be an extremely uncomfortable process. I wrote this in a piece for News 24. If the independent panel did its work behind closed doors, the impeachment committee will be public and it will be televised.
Yeah. And let's remember that the National Assembly, when the ANC had the majority then outright, used its powers ultimately in line just before the ANC elective conference of that time to ensure that, Ramaphosa was shielded and thus he'd be re-elected and continue to be the president. Obviously, things are much different now in the government of national unity, where the ANC is relying on the DA and the other national coalition partners, right, to get certain things over the line. Meanwhile, all during this time, Kyle, you've been doing excellent work. You filed this application to get hold of this police watchdog in the Independent Police Investigative Directorate report, which brings all new complexities and a whole new fresh perspective to everything thus far. Yeah. What, broadly speaking, did these findings reveal? Essentially, as I understand it, that there was, a deliberate cover-up of the Phala Phala couch money theft, and that, as you've already alluded to, this particular figure, Major General Wally Rhoode, is singled out here, is he not?
Yeah, so IPID's mandate is, and the mandate of that investigation was to look into the conduct of police officers, namely General Rueda and some other members of the Presidential Protection Service. So in effect, what happened here, Graeme, is that after the break-in, the president told Wally Rueda, look, there's been a break-in at the farm. On Rueda's version, the president did not immediately tell him that money had been stolen. This was only told to Rueda about a month later. But Rueda's job as head of the PPS is to ensure the protection of the president. This includes protecting properties that he may frequent. It includes protecting family members. It's a very complex organizational job to try and protect someone who has a large family, who has many properties in Cape Town and Limpopo and Johannesburg. It's not an easy job. So when you hear, as the head of the PPS, that a break-in has occurred, it's a very serious issue. Regardless of what was stolen, whether it was a watch or whether it was $4 million hidden under couch cushions, it reflects on the safety of the president of the country. So what occurred is that Rueda then, he claims that he spoke to the late Major General Sandile Ngcobo, his boss at the time, and who instructed him to do a preliminary inquiry just to check, what's going on, if there's any risk to the president. Rueda claims he stayed within the bounds of that. He just did a preliminary look at everything to try and determine whether there was any ongoing risk to the president. However, what we have reported as News 24, what other journalists have picked up, what Arthur Fraser has alleged from the very beginning, and what the IPID report in effect confirms, is that an off-the-books investigation was conducted, not only to trace suspect, not only to do an estimate on the threat levels, but to actually trace suspects, to try and find some of the money, to go a step further. And this must all be seen against the backdrop that the break-in was never reported to the police. So there was never anyone who went to the Bella Bella police station, which is, about 30 minutes drive away from the farm, to say, listen, there's been a break-in, we're just recording it, here's a case number, etc. Now, all of that points to the fact that people around the president wanted to spare him the embarrassment of having to explain the break-in, number one, and number two, then the additional problem of the money that was there became known to various individuals. And I think that cemented in many people's mind that they did the right thing by not going to the police immediately. Years later, of course, this decision is being viewed as very, very suspicious, because it speaks to, in effect, an attempt to not only simply cover up the burglary, but to cover up the fact that the money was there and where the money may have come from. What this IPID report does is it examines Rueda's conduct. And in particular, it focuses on a trip to Namibia in June of 2020, a couple of months after the break-in, by Wally Rueda and Bajani Chauke, the president's advisor. During that time, the country was in hard lockdown because of COVID-19. There were no airplanes flying. And the story is that Rueda and Chauke went to Namibia to visit Kyle, who was the then president of Namibia, to say to him, to impart to him information about the national security of another country.
And just to tell our lead listeners at this point, Mr. Ngcobo sadly died, so he's no longer around.
He is now late. So unfortunately, we are not able to test this version with him. But in effect, they travel to Narco border post by vehicle, official police vehicle. It's three individuals. They rent guest house rooms in Uppington. The junior officer remains behind at the guest house, and Wally Rueda and Bajani Chauke drive the official police vehicle to the border. It is parked at the border. They cross the border on foot. Their passports are stamped, and they are picked up by a Namibian state police helicopter in no man's land and then flown to Windhoek, where they spend the night and meet with the president of Namibia the following morning. Now, we have no confirmation whatsoever what this information is that was so desperately important to impart to the Namibian president that couldn't have been done over a telephone or in a secure encrypted, sort of messaging platform or anything like that, considering the COVID-19 lockdowns at the time. But what we do know, Graeme, and this is very crucial, is that just a couple of days before that trip happened, Emanuela David, who had already been identified by Rueda and the people helping him investigate this, had crossed the border into Namibia illegally. At that point, we know that Emanuela David had already alluded to breaking into the president's farm to Namibian police. And it is my very strong suspicion that that trip was directly related, despite the denials by everyone involved, to the arrest of Emanuela David. And what specifically was requested of the Namibian government, it is unclear. But Emanuela David was held in custody in Namibia until November of 2020, when he was deported. And despite his identity as a suspected burglar of the president's farm and thief of these dollars being known to very senior police officials, he was allowed to come back into South Africa unaccosted, unmolested, was not pursued by the South African Police Service at any point after his return.
Sure. And then, Kyle, just to add a little bit more flavor before we wrap up, here's this report by a police financial investigator who found further evidence that Emanuela David was spending a hell of a lot of money coming through his bank account. And it would suggest then that the estimates of the money that was taken from the couch could be closer to the equivalent of 15 million rand?
Yes, so as part of that burglary trial in Modimolle, Emanuela David's finances were looked at. You know, subpoenas were filed to various banking institutions by the Hawks. Remember, this is all based on Arthur Fraser's complaint back in 2022.
Yeah.
And I've managed to, after quite a lot of effort and struggle to get actually get hold of this report, we had to wait until it was, officially discovered to Emanuela's defense team and read into the record in court. And finally, having had a look at this report, remember, Emanuela David was one of 5 suspected burglars. The version of the president, the official version, was that $580,000 was stolen. That's the equivalent of, in 2019, early 2020 exchange rates, roughly 9.5, 10 million rand. Starting in February of 2020, within a day or two after the burglary, Emanuela David is spending enormous amounts of money, handing over dollars in cash to East Rand car business, car dealers, buying a Golf 7R, buying a Polo for his girlfriend, buying, expensive Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon vehicles, a Porsche Carrera 4S, and so on. And all of these transactions, that financial report and other information that I've managed to obtain during my investigation shows was done in cash. So we know an estimated 4.7 million rand in cash transactions with dollars was done just on vehicles between February and May of 2020 by just one of the burglars, Emanuela David. If you then look at the Hawks financial investigation, which speaks to money in bank accounts, right? Remember, we have this cash component. Now we have money in bank accounts. It shows that Emanuela David used his mother and his sister's bank accounts to deposit vast sums of cash over many, many months, starting in February 2020, shortly after the burglary. This means that he obviously had access to an informal foreign exchange network, that he was able to change these dollars for rands, legitimize the money, put it into his bank account, and then it was used for day-to-day expenses, groceries. I believe there are 1,979 card transactions in the space of 2 years on Emanuela David's F&B bank account, totaling something like 2.3 million rand in swiped expenses. So what we can see is very clearly Emanuela David, one of the 5 burglars, had access to approximately 15 million rand in the immediate aftermath of the burglary and the months thereafter. Bearing in mind that the other burglars, some of whom immediately fled back to Cape Town, we were able to also trace very early on in the investigation, myself and Jeff Wicks and Azara Karim were involved in digging very deep into the lives of these men. And we were able to show that, for example, one of the alleged burglars bought a property in Cape Town in Bloubergstrand for 2 million rand. In addition to spending money on cars, in addition to, you can imagine when you suddenly have access to this amount of cash, what money is being spent on: nightclubs, alcohol, fancy clothes, the nice cars, all of these things, taking your family out to a fancy restaurant, et cetera, et cetera. All of this shows us that the amount of money these burglars had access to is far more than the $580,000. And that brings us back to the official version, the cover-up, the idea that this money was for buffaloes, that everyone has always been very skeptical about. Now we are slowly starting to see proof that this version is implausible. And it's not proof that journalists have managed to dig up, struggling and strifing and trying to convince people to give us information. This is part of an official police investigation prosecuting one of the burglars in this case. And it's before the South African court system. It is now part of the public record.
Right. Let's end off right here, right now. These alleged Phala Phala burglars, right? They try to get their charges, basically scrapped. They pleaded before the courts, rather, let's throw this whole thing out. That was basically rubbish in and itself. And now they're due to face formal trial proceedings, which would be in the middle of this year, June, right? So if we take it based on when Fraser's allegations came out, also June 2022, finally now in 2026, 4 years later, it seems as if, and notwithstanding that the burglary happened in 2020, it's 6 years later that finally this whole thing would finally go to trial. Are they currently behind bars, or do they have bail? Just to end off to anybody who doesn't know the nitty-gritties of that case, what are the proceedings we can look forward to now?
Yeah, so Emanuela David did not secure bail, but Floriana Joseph and her brother did get bail, based on my recollection. But they're facing charges of housebreaking, conspiracy to commit housebreaking, and Emanuela David is facing charges of money laundering for the way he used those bank accounts. And they brought that application, a Section 174 application, to have the charges against them dismissed after the state rested its case. So the case has been ongoing for about a year in that courtroom. And effectively, the grounds that they tried to rely on was that the only evidence that the state has that they were involved in this burglary is contemporaneous, it is circumstantial, it is the money, and of course the cell phone analysis showing their whereabouts on the night of the burglary and thereafter. There is no direct evidence of fingerprints, CCTV, anything like that. And this is attributable, Graeme, I think, to the very thing that Arthur Fraser accused the president and his top aides of, and that is the apparent cover-up, the delay for about 2 years before an official investigation started. I have deep sympathy for, the officers from the Hawks who were roped in to try and investigate all of this so long after the fact. Some key witnesses had passed away. Other suspects had fled to Namibia. It was an extremely difficult case to investigate. One of the suspects is still in Namibia and extradition proceedings are underway. That could take further many years to happen. But yes, on the 25th of May, the case resumes. And at that point, we are expecting that Emanuela David and the Joseph siblings will start presenting their defense. We will start to hear about their excuses, their story. We'll get their version finally, at long last, of this whole saga. Who knew what, when, and where? It's quite exciting for me. I've been following this quite closely, and this will be the first time that Emanuela David's version will be made public.
Sure. All while, who knows by then how far along Parliament will be with the formal impeachment proceedings in a committee. And for people wondering, impeachment doesn't necessarily mean anybody's guilty. It's the ventilating of a claim via a legislative process, right? Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong, that legislatively our lawmakers go, we're accusing the president of alleged wrongdoing. And so thus need to, ventilate that process further. And who knows how long Ramaphosa's, process would be to challenge the panel report and Ngcobo's report on review, how far along that would be. I just wanted to get this very lastly from you, and just give me a yes or no answer, and we can call it quits here. That IPID report, it could see in your reporting, you point to this, that the IPID report could see a DC disciplinary hearing process follow for Major General Wally Rhoode. But does it hold any weight to bite the president at all?
Yes. I think that IPID's findings about the purpose of the trip to Namibia is deeply significant to the president, for the reason that his public version and the public version of those around him has already provided the reason, the so-called reason for the trip to Namibia. If the president was involved, and we know he was involved in instructing Rueda to accompany Chauke to Namibia, and that trip was about Phala Phala and the arrest of Emanuela David, it places President Cyril Ramaphosa directly involved in the cover-up of the burglary months after it happened. That, in my view, would be a very serious and impeachable offense. It would show the country that President Cyril Ramaphosa has not been honest to date about what really happened at Phala Phala.
Yeah, and just to add, right at the end of it all, the next ANC elective conference, for those wondering, is in December 2027. Who knows what's going to happen up until then? As in South African politics, it's always a roller coaster, is it not, Kyle?
Every day, something new. We'll try and keep up.
Yeah, Kyle, thank you so much. I think we touched everything, right?
Yeah, that's everything.
Thanks, Brew. Keep well. Look after yourself. Chat soon.
Cheers, man.
And finally,
ending off now with On This Day in SA History, of course, courtesy the SA History online database. The mayor of Welkom in the then Orange Free State, as it was known, was tarred and feathered, not literally, on this day, the 13th of May 1989, although the feathered part is literal, but not so much the tarred part. But what happened was this. Mayor Gus Gous was officiating a multiracial wheelchair race when suddenly a group of men poured a sticky substance over his head and threw feathers at him. It's understood Gous had raised the ire of his local white National Party voting constituency when he vowed to open up a taxi rank in the middle of Welkom CBD. Gous's aide and a security official were also roughed up at the time. The police ended up arresting some 4 suspects for assault, but in the end, as SA History Online remembers it, the men were let off with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. I guess we may never know who won that wheelchair race. And in Roby's Pointless Brian quiz for today, I told you it was a bit of a tricky question, but which model of Mercedes-Benz did a TikToker drive in which he's seen on video doing so recklessly in the Kruger National Park? A red SL500. Pietrus Janssen van Rensburg, who's his real name, has since taken to social media to say sorry for the wheel spins and drifting inside the park. Sandpark says, though, it's all too little too late, and has vowed to take this matter further, not just against the driver, but Sandpark's gate officials on camera egging him on to rip it. Here's a clip of that video very quickly.
I feel this, okay?
Okay, shut up. Thank you.
I just want to say this. If Mr. JVR Online was really sorry about all of this, why then is his TikToks of the incident in question still online? Yeah, I'll let you decide that one. If you've got anything else there, drop us a comment below. You can also mail us, theleader24.com. We're open to all of your feedback in relation to anything that is said on this podcast, which, by the way, is governed by the Press Council of South Africa, and we generally adhere to the rules set out by the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Each edition is quality checked by a senior member and or news editor of News 24. That's it for The Lead this week. You might have noticed we're coming out a little bit less frequently these days. That's because I'm going to be launching a brand new show that is coming out later this week. I can't wait for you to hear a little bit more about it. We're calling it News 24 Unread. Essentially, everything you need to know from the week that was, and then some, is going to be our new flagship bulletin, so look out for that. My name's Graeme Robenheimer, and so long as there's trusted news first, we'll have The Lead.